The year is 280 BC. On a blood-soaked plain near the Greek city of Heraclea in southern Italy, two armies face each other in what will become one of history's most paradoxical battles. On one side stand the disciplined legions of Rome, their bronze armor gleaming in the Mediterranean sun, their rectangular shields locked in perfect formation. They have never known defeat against any Italian enemy. On the other side, a sight that would make even the bravest Roman soldiers' blood run cold. 20 war elephants, massive gray beasts with tusks like ivory spears, their eyes wild with the chaos of battle. Atop these living fortresses sit Greek warriors, and behind them march the finest soldiers money can buy. The professional armies of Pyrrhus, king of Epirus, a man who claimed to be the heir of Alexander the Great himself. By day's end, one of these armies would claim victory. But here's the twist that would echo through history. The winner would be the true loser, and the loser would ultimately triumph. This is the story of how a king's greatest victory became his most devastating defeat, and how Rome learned that sometimes losing a battle is the first step to winning a war. What happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? What happens when victory costs more than defeat? The answer lies in understanding one of history's most misunderstood conflicts, the Pyrrhic War. To understand the earthquake that was about to shake the ancient world, we must first understand Rome in 280 BC. This was not yet the empire of Caesar and Augustus. This was not the Rome that would conquer Gaul, cross the Rubicon, or rule the Mediterranean. This was the Roman Republic, ambitious, expanding, but still learning the harsh lessons of power. Picture Rome as a teenager who has grown strong in the neighborhood but has never ventured beyond familiar streets. For 2.5 centuries, Roman legions had been steadily conquering the Italian peninsula, tribe by tribe, city by city. They had developed a military machine unlike anything the world had seen. Not professional soldiers like the Greeks, but citizen farmers who dropped their plows to pick up their swords whenever duty called. The Roman legion was built on discipline, not brilliance. Where Greek armies relied on individual heroism and tactical genius, Romans trusted in training, organization, and an almost religious devotion to the state. Every Roman soldier knew his place, knew his duty, and knew that failure meant not just personal dishonor, but shame for his family and his ancestors, stretching back generations. But Rome's greatest strength was also becoming its greatest weakness. Success bred arrogance. Victory after victory against Italian tribes had convinced many Romans that their way of war was simply superior to all others. They had never faced elephants. They had never fought against the tactical sophistication of professional Greek armies. They had never encountered a general who had studied at the feet of Alexander's successors. The Roman political system in 280 BC was a delicate balance between competing forces. 2 consuls, elected annually, shared executive power. The Senate, filled with former magistrates, provided continuity and wisdom, at least in theory. The popular assemblies gave the common people a voice, though it was often drowned out by the influence of wealth and family connections. This system had one crucial flaw. It encouraged bold action and discouraged careful planning. Consuls served for only 1 year, which meant they had 12 months to make their mark on history. Military glory was the fastest path to political immortality. A successful war could elevate a man's family for generations. A defensive strategy, no matter how wise, rarely won votes. By 280 BC, Roman expansion had brought them to the very tip of the Italian boot. Here, in an area the Romans called Magna Graecia, Greater Greece, lay a collection of wealthy Greek city-states that had been established centuries earlier by colonists from the Greek homeland. These cities, Tarentum, Croton, Rhegium, were rich, sophisticated, and thoroughly Greek in culture and outlook. Tarentum was the crown jewel of this Greek south. Its harbor was one of the finest in the Mediterranean. Its citizens were wealthy from trade and proud of their Spartan heritage. But wealth had made them soft, and pride had made them careless. When Rome's influence began creeping southward, the Tarentines found themselves facing a terrible choice. Submit to these upstart Italians or fight for their independence. The spark that ignited the war came from an incident that perfectly captured the cultural clash between Greek and Roman worldviews. In 282 BC, a Roman fleet appeared in the harbor of Tarentum, technically violating an old treaty that restricted Roman naval activity in Greek waters. The Tarentines, drunk on wine and outraged pride, attacked the Roman ships, sinking 4 and capturing 1. It was an act of breathtaking stupidity. The Tarentines had just given Rome exactly what it needed: a casus belli, a legal justification for war. But the Greeks of southern Italy knew they could never stand alone against Roman power. They needed help, professional, deadly help. They needed Pyrrhus. King Pyrrhus of Epirus was everything a Greek hero should be. Tall, charismatic, brilliant in battle, and blessed with the kind of restless ambition that made lesser men tremble. He claimed descent from Achilles himself and styled himself as the heir to Alexander's legacy. But Pyrrhus lived in an age when the great conquests seemed finished. Macedonia was in decline. The Egyptian Ptolemies were focused on holding what they had, and the Seleucid Empire was too vast to manage effectively. Pyrrhus was a king without a kingdom worthy of his ambitions. His realm of Epirus, nestled in the mountains between Greece and the Adriatic, was tough and poor. Its warriors were fierce, but few. Its treasury was modest. For a man who dreamed of matching Alexander's achievements, Epirus felt like a cage. When the Tarentine ambassadors arrived at Pyrrhus's court with tales of Roman aggression and promises of Greek gold, they found a king eager to listen. Here was opportunity wearing the mask of duty. Pyrrhus could present himself as the defender of Greek civilization against barbarian invaders while pursuing his own dreams of conquest. But Pyrrhus was not just another ambitious king. He was a military genius who had learned warfare from Antigonus, one of Alexander's most successful successors. He understood the new science of Hellenistic warfare, the coordination of infantry, cavalry, light troops, and those massive war elephants that had terrorized enemies from India to Egypt. The elephants were Pyrrhus's secret weapon. These magnificent beasts, trained for war, could scatter infantry formations that had never seen their like. A charging elephant was a living siege engine capable of trampling through the tightest formations. The psychological impact was even greater than the physical. Horses fled in terror from their scent, and even veteran soldiers could be reduced to panic by their trumpeting roars. As Pyrrhus prepared his expedition to Italy, he could hardly have imagined the true nature of his enemy. Rome appeared to be just another Italian confederation, larger than most, but fundamentally similar to the dozens of tribal alliances his armies had already defeated. The Romans had no elephants, no professional troops, no history of fighting beyond Italy. How difficult could they be? This mutual misunderstanding, Rome underestimating Greek tactical sophistication, Pyrrhus underestimating Roman resilience, was about to produce one of history's most instructive conflicts. Both sides thought they knew what they were facing. Both sides were catastrophically wrong. The stage was set for a collision that would reshape the ancient world. In one corner, Rome, the rising power that had never learned to accept defeat. In the other, Pyrrhus, the last great Greek conqueror, leading the finest army money could buy. Between them lay the question that would define the next century of Mediterranean history. When expansion meets resistance, which force proves stronger? The winter of 281 BC was unusually harsh across the Italian peninsula. In Rome, the forum buzzed with heated debates as senators wrapped in thick togas argued over the Tarentine crisis. The attack on Roman ships could not go unanswered. Roman dignity demanded satisfaction. But beneath the rhetoric of honor and justice lay a more complex calculation. Rome in 281 BC was like a shark that had to keep moving to survive. The entire Roman system depended on constant expansion. Victory brought slaves, tribute, and land to distribute to Rome's growing population. Peace, on the other hand, brought internal tension as ambitious politicians competed for limited opportunities, and common soldiers returned to farms that could barely support their families. The Senate was divided between the cautious elders who remembered harder times and the ambitious young men who had grown up knowing only victory. The old guard, led by men like Appius Claudius, urged restraint. "These Greeks fight like their ancestors who conquered Persia," Claudius warned in one famous speech. "They have elephants and professional soldiers. This is not like fighting mountain tribes." But the war party, fired by visions of Greek gold and Eastern glory, dismissed such concerns. "Are we to tremble before merchants and philosophers?" demanded one young senator. "Have we conquered all of Italy only to bow to wine sellers and poetry reciters?" The decision for war was perhaps inevitable. Roman culture celebrated aggressive action and scorned defensive hesitation. When the Tarentines compounded their offense by expelling the Roman garrison from the nearby city of Thurii and installing a democratic government hostile to Roman interests, even the cautious faction had to admit that Roman credibility was at stake. The Romans dispatched their ultimatum with characteristic directness: return the Roman prisoners, restore the pro-Roman government in Thurii, and pay compensation for the destroyed ships. The alternative was war. It was the kind of demand designed to be rejected, giving Rome legal and moral justification for what it intended to do anyway. The Tarentine response revealed the cultural chasm between the two sides. Instead of a formal diplomatic rejection, they sent back a message dripping with Greek intellectual contempt. "Romans, you who cannot even speak properly, how can you hope to rule properly? Learn first to govern yourselves before presuming to govern others." It was exactly the kind of insult that made Roman blood boil. The Greeks saw it as witty repartee. The Romans saw it as barbarian arrogance that demanded crushing response. While diplomats exchanged insults, both sides prepared for war with very different strategies. The Romans approached the conflict as they had every other Italian campaign: raise the legions, march south, force a decisive battle, accept submission. It was a formula that had never failed them. The Tarentines, meanwhile, dispatched increasingly desperate embassies to every Greek power that might help them. Most were too busy with their own problems to intervene in a distant Italian war. But Pyrrhus was different. The Epirot king saw opportunity where others saw only risk. Pyrrhus's decision to intervene was not made lightly. He consulted oracles, questioned advisors, and weighed the odds with the careful calculation of a professional gambler. The risks were enormous. Italy was far from his power base. Defeat would mean the end of his kingdom and probably his life. Success would require not just military victory, but the creation of a stable new empire in hostile territory. But the potential rewards were even greater. Italy was rich, populous, and strategically positioned. Control of the Greek cities would give him naval bases and commercial wealth. Victory over Rome would establish him as the premier military power in the Western Mediterranean. From Italy, he could eye Sicily, North Africa, even Spain. It was a chance to carve out an empire worthy of Alexander's heir. The king's closest advisors were divided. His treasurer, Cineas, was a practical man who understood that kingdoms were built on gold as much as glory. He calculated the costs of the expedition and questioned whether Pyrrhus could afford a prolonged campaign. "Majesty," he reportedly said, "if we conquer Rome, what then? Will we not want Sicily? And after Sicily, will we not look toward Carthage? And after Carthage, what new enemy will arise to threaten our conquests?" But Pyrrhus had the gambler's fatal flaw. He could see only the next victory, never the ultimate price. "My good Cineas," he replied, Once we have conquered all our enemies, we can rest and enjoy our triumphs. The advisor's gentle response cut to the heart of the matter. Majesty, why not rest and enjoy what we have now? It was wisdom that Pyrrhus could not hear. The die was cast. The king's preparations were meticulous. He gathered 20,000 infantry, 3,000 cavalry, 2,000 archers, 500 slingers, and 20 war elephants. A force that represented the pinnacle of Hellenistic military science. Every soldier was a professional, trained for years in the complex maneuvers that made Greek armies so effective. The infantry fought in the phalanx formation with long spears called sarissas that could outreach any Roman weapon. The cavalry were skilled horse archers who could harass enemies from a distance or deliver crushing charges at the decisive moment. But the elephants were the real game changers. These weren't just animals. They were weapons platforms, each one carrying a crew of warriors and capable of spreading panic through any formation. Rome had never faced elephants in battle. They had no tactics to counter them, no experience of their psychological impact. As spring arrived in 280 BC, Pyrrhus's expedition fleet gathered in the ports of Epirus. Ships loaded with soldiers, horses, supplies, and those massive elephants prepared to cross the treacherous waters between Greece and Italy. It was a sight that would have impressed Alexander himself, the largest Greek military expedition to the west since the Trojan War. The crossing was nearly a disaster. Spring storms in the Adriatic scattered Pyrrhus's fleet, and many ships were lost with all hands. The king himself barely survived when his flagship was driven onto the Italian coast, battered and taking on water. For a moment, it seemed as if the gods had already decided the campaign's fate, but Pyrrhus was made of sterner stuff. He rallied his scattered forces, counted his losses, and pressed on. The expedition had lost perhaps a third of its strength in the crossing, but what remained was still a formidable force. More importantly, it was a force unlike anything Rome had ever faced. When Pyrrhus landed at Tarentum in early summer 280 BC, he found his Greek allies in a state of nervous excitement. The wealthy merchants and intellectuals who had invited him began to have second thoughts when they saw the reality of professional soldiers occupying their city. War was one thing when discussed in comfortable symposiums, quite another when armed men demanded food, lodging, and military service. The king moved quickly to establish control. He imposed martial law, began training local militias, and sent diplomatic missions to other Greek cities in southern Italy. Some joined his cause willingly, seeing him as a liberator from Roman oppression. Others had to be persuaded with more direct methods. Pyrrhus understood that he needed more than just military victory. He needed to create a political alliance that could survive Roman retaliation. Meanwhile, Roman preparations proceeded with characteristic efficiency. The Senate voted to raise 4 legions, nearly 20,000 men, and placed them under the command of Consul Publius Valerius Laevinus. Laevinus was a competent general with experience fighting Italian tribes, but like most Romans, he had little understanding of Greek military methods. The consul's strategy was typically Roman: march south, find the enemy, force a battle, win through superior discipline and courage. It was a plan that had worked against Samnites, Etruscans, and dozens of other Italian peoples. Why should Greeks be any different? As the two armies converged on the plains near Heraclea, neither commander fully understood what he was about to face. Pyrrhus expected to fight undisciplined barbarians who would break at the first charge of his elephants. Laevinus expected to face typical Greek troops who would flee when confronted by Roman determination. Both were about to receive a very expensive education. The question that had haunted military theorists for generations was about to be answered in blood and iron. What happens when the methodical discipline of the Roman legion meets the tactical sophistication of the Hellenistic phalanx? The ancient world was about to find out. The morning of the battle dawned clear and hot. July in southern Italy could be brutal, and the sun promised to be merciless to men fighting in bronze armor. On the plain near Heraclea, two very different armies prepared for what each believed would be a decisive encounter. Consul Laevinus had arrived first, choosing his ground with care. The Romans positioned themselves on a slight rise that would give them the advantage of higher ground and force the enemy to attack uphill. It was standard Roman tactical doctrine. Find good defensive terrain and let the enemy exhaust themselves trying to dislodge you. The Roman army was a thing of beauty in its geometric precision. 4 legions deployed in the traditional triplex asses, the triple line that had proved so effective against Italian enemies. The hastati, young soldiers in the prime of life, formed the front rank with their short swords and heavy javelins. Behind them stood the principes, veteran soldiers who formed the backbone of Roman fighting strength. In the rear waited the triarii, grizzled old warriors whose long spears were the army's final reserve. Each Roman soldier had been drilled until formation fighting became second nature. They knew exactly how far to stand from their neighbor, exactly when to throw their javelins, exactly how to work together as an unstoppable machine of war. What they didn't know was how to fight elephants. Pyrrhus approached the battlefield with the eye of a professional general who had studied warfare his entire life. He could see immediately that the Romans had chosen their ground well. The slope would make his elephant charge less effective and force his phalanx to advance uphill. But the Greek king had advantages of his own, and he intended to use them. The sight of Pyrrhus's army deploying for battle must have been magnificent and terrifying. In the center, his Epirot phalanx formed up with the precision of a religious ceremony. These were not citizen soldiers like the Romans, but professionals who had trained together for years. Their sarissas, 18-foot spears held in both hands, created a forest of iron points that stretched for hundreds of yards. On the flanks, the Salian and Tarentine cavalry took their positions. These horsemen were the elite of their societies, men who had grown up in the saddle and learned to fight with sword and lance while controlling their mounts with pressure from their knees. They watched the Roman cavalry with the contempt of experts evaluating amateurs, but it was the elephants that drew every eye. 20 massive beasts, each one a mobile fortress carrying a crew of warriors. The elephants had been painted for war, their tusks sharpened to gleaming points, their bodies decorated with the bright colors that made them even more terrifying to enemies who had never seen their like. The smell of them, musky, wild, alien, carried across the battlefield on the morning breeze. Roman soldiers who had faced charging Gallic warriors without flinching found themselves genuinely nervous for the first time in their military careers. These were not just large animals. These were weapons from another world, creatures that belonged in the myths of distant lands, not on an Italian battlefield. Laevinus held a final conference with his senior officers as the armies completed their deployments. The consul was confident but not arrogant. He had studied the reports from Roman merchants who had seen Greek armies in action, and he knew he faced a more sophisticated enemy than the tribal confederations Rome was used to fighting. Remember, he told his commanders, these Greeks fight in deep formations with long spears. Our advantage lies in flexibility. If we can break their line at any point, their whole formation becomes vulnerable. Watch for gaps. Press any advantage and trust in Roman discipline. It was sound tactical thinking, but it revealed how little the Romans really understood about their enemy. The phalanx wasn't just a formation. It was a fighting system backed by centuries of tactical evolution. Breaking it would require more than courage and determination. Across the field, Pyrrhus was making his own final preparations. The king had a reputation for personal bravery that bordered on recklessness, but he was also a careful planner who left nothing to chance. He rode along the front of his army, speaking to his men in the casual, confident tone that marked him as a leader who shared their dangers. Romans, he told his soldiers, fight like farmers. They know only straight ahead. They have never seen elephants, never faced the phalanx, never met professionals in battle. Today we show them what real soldiers can do. But Pyrrhus was too experienced a general to underestimate any enemy. He had positioned his forces carefully, with the elephants ready to exploit any breakthrough and the cavalry prepared to sweep around the Roman flanks. If the battle went according to plan, the Romans would be crushed between his phalanx and his mobile forces. The signal for battle came with the harsh blare of war trumpets. The sound echoed across the plain, freezing the moment before violence erupted. For a heartbeat, 20,000 men stood poised on the edge of history. The Romans moved first, as Pyrrhus had expected. The Hastati advanced at the measured pace that had carried Roman eagles across Italy, their javelins ready, their shields locked in perfect formation. They looked unstoppable, a bronze wall rolling forward with mechanical precision. But as they climbed the slight slope toward the Greek line, the Romans encountered something they had never faced before: the sheer physical presence of the phalanx. The Epirot formation was deeper than any Roman line, with sarissa points projecting 15 feet beyond the front rank. It was like facing a giant porcupine, all teeth and spines and no apparent weakness. The Roman javelins, those devastating weapons that had shattered so many enemy formations, seemed almost puny against the forest of Greek spear points. Roman soldiers found themselves trying to fight an enemy they couldn't reach, jabbing futilely with their short swords while 18-foot sarissas thrust at them from beyond their range. But the Romans were learning fast. Individual soldiers began trying to grab the Greek spears, to snap them or pull their wielders out of formation. Others used their shields as battering rams, trying to create gaps they could exploit. It was desperate, brutal fighting that demanded every ounce of Roman stubbornness. For a crucial moment, it looked like Roman determination might prevail through sheer bloody-mindedness. The Hastati were actually beginning to bend the Greek line, forcing the phalanx back step by grudging step. Pyrrhus could see his center beginning to waver under the relentless Roman pressure. This was the moment of truth that would determine the battle's outcome. A lesser general might have panicked or committed his reserves too early. But Pyrrhus was Alexander's heir, and he understood that timing was everything in warfare. The king raised his sword high, the signal his cavalry commanders had been waiting for. With a sound like thunder, the Thessalian horse launched their charge against the Roman right flank. At the same moment, Pyrrhus gave the order that would change the face of warfare in the western Mediterranean. "Release the elephants." The great beasts moved forward with a slow, irresistible majesty that was more terrifying than any wild charge. Their handlers guided them toward the wavering point in the Roman line, where the Hastati were still pushing against the Greek phalanx. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Roman soldiers who had never flinched from human enemies found themselves face to face with living nightmares. The elephants trumpeted their war cries, a sound like nothing in the Italian experience. Their massive feet shook the ground. Their tusks gleamed like ivory spears in the morning sun. But this was where Roman discipline proved its worth. Instead of breaking and fleeing, the Hastati tried to adapt to this new threat. Some hurled their javelins at the great beasts, scoring hits that drew blood but seemed to do little damage. Others tried to get underneath the elephants to attack their vulnerable bellies with their short swords. It was magnificent courage, but courage alone was not enough. The elephants crashed into the Roman line like living battering rams, trampling men underfoot and scattering formations that had never been broken. Behind them came the Epirot phalanx, pressing forward with renewed confidence. The Roman center was beginning to crumble, but the battle was far from over. This was where the Roman military system showed its greatest strength, its ability to absorb punishment and keep fighting. As the Hastati fell back in disorder, the Principes stepped forward to take their place. Fresh troops, disciplined and determined, met the Greek advance with renewed resistance. But Pyrrhus had one more card to play, and he played it with perfect timing. The battle had been raging for 2 hours under the merciless Italian sun, and both armies were beginning to feel the strain. The Romans had lost their initial formation, but they had not broken. Like a many-headed hydra, each time one line was scattered, another stepped forward to take its place. The Principes were holding firm against the combined pressure of elephants and phalanx, their discipline unshaken despite the chaos around them. But Pyrrhus could see that the crucial moment was approaching. His own forces were tiring, and the elephants, magnificent as they were, could not sustain their charge indefinitely. The great beasts were wounded and growing increasingly difficult to control. Several had already been forced to withdraw when Roman javelins found vulnerable spots. The king made a decision that would be studied in military academies for centuries to come. Instead of continuing the frontal assault, he ordered a tactical withdrawal of his center while simultaneously launching coordinated flank attacks with his cavalry. It was a maneuver of breathtaking complexity, the kind of sophisticated battlefield management that separated professional generals from mere warriors. The Roman response revealed both their strengths and their limitations. Consul Laevinus saw the Greek center pulling back and immediately ordered an advance, thinking he had won a crucial advantage. It was exactly what Pyrrhus had hoped for. The Roman line, already disordered by hours of fighting, stretched even thinner as it pursued what it believed was a retreating enemy. On the Roman right flank, the Thessalian cavalry struck with devastating effect. These were horsemen who had learned their trade in the endless wars of the successor kingdoms, men who could fight with sword or bow from the saddle and who understood the psychological impact of a perfectly timed charge. The Roman cavalry, brave but inexperienced in facing such professional opposition, began to give way. But it was on the left flank that Pyrrhus played his masterstroke. The king had kept a reserve of his finest troops, the Epirote royal guard and a small group of elephants hidden behind a low hill. As the Roman line advanced and exposed its flank, these elite forces emerged like a thunderbolt from clear sky. The sight of fresh enemy troops appearing where none were expected might have shattered the morale of a less disciplined army. But these were Romans, and they met this new threat with the stubborn courage that was their defining characteristic. The Triarii, those grizzled veterans who formed the army's final reserve, wheeled to face this unexpected attack. What followed was perhaps the finest display of Roman military virtue in the entire battle. Outnumbered and outflanked, facing enemy forces that included war elephants and the finest soldiers in the Greek world, the Triarii held their ground. Their long spears, similar to Greek sarissas, gave them the reach to engage the elephants, while their experience allowed them to maintain formation even under extreme pressure. For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the fate of Rome hung in the balance. If the Triarii broke, the entire Roman army would be destroyed. Italian expansion would end, Roman influence would collapse, and the Western Mediterranean would remain forever Greek. But Roman discipline held. More than that, it began to tell. The Triarii fought with the desperate skill of men who knew they were their army's last hope, and their resistance began to slow the Epirote advance. Individual acts of heroism multiplied into collective defiance. Roman soldiers who should have been overwhelmed by superior numbers and professional training refused to acknowledge defeat. Pyrrhus himself led the crucial charge that finally broke Roman resistance on the left flank. The king fought in the front ranks, his royal armor gleaming, his sword rising and falling with mechanical precision. He was everything a Homeric hero should be: brave, skilled, inspiring to his men and terrifying to his enemies. When the Roman flank finally collapsed, it went suddenly and completely. The Triarii, who had held so magnificently for so long, were simply overwhelmed by the combination of elephants, phalanx, and cavalry. Those who could do so retreated in good order. Those who couldn't died where they stood, facing their enemies to the last. The collapse of the Roman left triggered a general withdrawal. Consul Laevinus, seeing that his army was in danger of being surrounded and annihilated, ordered a fighting retreat toward the Roman camp. It was a decision that saved what remained of his forces, but it meant abandoning the battlefield to Pyrrhus. The retreat was a masterpiece of Roman military discipline. Even in defeat, the legions maintained their formation and fought off Greek attempts to turn retreat into rout. The Roman camp, fortified according to standard military practice, provided a secure base from which the survivors could reorganize, but the cost had been enormous. Of the 20,000 Romans who had started the day, nearly 8,000 were casualties. Among the dead lay the flower of Roman military leadership, centurions who had fought in a dozen campaigns, young officers from noble families, veteran soldiers whose experience would be sorely missed in future battles. Pyrrhus had won a complete tactical victory. But as he surveyed the battlefield in the fading afternoon light, the king began to understand the true nature of his enemy. Roman casualties were heavy, but so were Greek losses. More importantly, the Romans had fought with a stubborn determination that was unlike anything in Pyrrhus's experience. "Another such victory and I am lost," the king reportedly told his advisors as they counted their dead. It was a prophetic statement that would give the language a new phrase: Pyrrhic Victory, a success so costly that it amounts to defeat. The Greek casualties were particularly painful because they were irreplaceable. Pyrrhus had brought professional soldiers from across the Greek world: Epirites, Thessalians, Macedonians, Tarentines. Each dead warrior represented years of training and experience. The Romans, on the other hand, could replace their losses from the enormous pool of Italian manpower they commanded. But for the moment, victory was victory, and Pyrrhus made the most of it. Greek cities throughout southern Italy declared for his cause, seeing in his success proof that Roman power was not invincible. Recruits flocked to his standards, and his treasury swelled with contributions from wealthy Greeks who wanted to be on the winning side. The king sent envoys to Rome demanding peace negotiations. His terms were reasonable by Greek standards: Roman recognition of Greek independence in southern Italy, return of conquered territories, and a mutual defense pact. It was the kind of negotiated settlement that had ended countless wars between Greek city-states. The Romans' response revealed just how fundamentally different their political culture was from anything in the Greek experience. If you're enjoying this journey through Roman history, consider subscribing. It helps us bring more untold stories of empires, battles, and philosophy to life. There are so many moments like this, where the course of civilization hung in the balance, and we're committed to telling them with the depth and drama they deserve. The Roman Senate's reaction to Pyrrhus's peace overtures was swift and uncompromising. Rome did not negotiate from a position of weakness. Rome did not accept territorial losses as the price of peace. Rome did not recognize the independence of cities it considered rebellious subjects. The debate in the Senate was fierce but brief. Some voices urged caution, pointing out that Pyrrhus had demonstrated his military superiority and might prove even more dangerous in a second encounter. But these counsels of prudence were overwhelmed by Roman pride and Roman logic. "If we yield to this Greek adventurer," declared one senator, "every enemy of Rome will think us weak. Every allied city will wonder if Roman protection is worth having. Every ambitious king will see Italy as ripe for conquest." It was an argument that struck to the heart of Roman strategic thinking. The Republic's entire system depended on the perception of invincible strength. Territorial concessions would not buy peace. They would invite aggression from every direction. But there was more to the Roman rejection than mere political calculation. The Senate genuinely believed that the defeat at Heraclea was a temporary setback, not a proof of Greek superiority. Roman losses had been heavy, but they had not been disproportionate to Greek casualties. More importantly, the Romans had learned valuable lessons about fighting elephants and phalanxes. The Senate's response to Pyrrhus was delivered by an elderly diplomat named Gaius Fabricius, a man whose personal integrity was legendary even by Roman standards. Fabricius's message was characteristically blunt. Rome would negotiate only from a position of strength. If Pyrrhus wanted peace, he was welcome to withdraw from Italy. Otherwise, Rome would raise new armies and continue the war. It was exactly the response Pyrrhus should have expected from Romans. But the king had been misled by his own cultural assumptions. In the Greek world, a decisive battlefield victory typically led to political settlement. The defeated side acknowledged their losses, paid an indemnity, and everyone moved on to the next conflict. But Rome was not a Greek city-state, and Romans did not think like Greeks. For Rome, Heraclea was not the end of the war, but the beginning of a longer struggle. The lesson was clear. If you fought Rome, you had to be prepared to fight Rome to the death. The winter of 208 or 279 BC was a time of preparation for both sides, but the nature of their preparations revealed the fundamental difference between Greek and Roman approaches to warfare. Pyrrhus spent the months consolidating his political gains, negotiating with potential allies, and trying to turn his military success into lasting strategic advantage. The Romans spent the winter raising new armies. Roman recruitment that winter was unlike anything in the Republic's history. The usual reluctance of farmers to leave their fields was overwhelmed by a wave of patriotic fury that swept through the Italian peninsula. The defeat at Heraclea had shocked Roman pride, but it had also awakened Roman determination. More importantly, Rome's Italian allies remained loyal. This was perhaps Pyrrhus's greatest miscalculation. The king had expected that Roman losses would trigger a general revolt of conquered peoples eager to throw off the yoke of Roman rule. Instead, the Italian allies saw Greek victory as a threat to their own interests. Rome's genius lay not just in conquest, but in integration. Unlike other ancient empires that ruled through fear and exploitation, Rome offered its subjects a path to partnership. Italian allies kept their own governments, their own customs, their own gods. What they gained in return was protection from external enemies and a share in Roman prosperity. The system created genuine loyalty, not mere submission. When Roman envoys traveled through Italy that winter, they found doors open and treasuries ready. The Latins, remembering their ancient kinship with Rome, provided troops and supplies without hesitation. The Samnites, so recently conquered, chose Roman partnership over Greek liberation. Even in Etruria, where hatred of Rome ran deep, most cities remained neutral rather than join Pyrrhus. The new Roman army that assembled in the spring of 279 BC was larger and more determined than the force that had fought at Heraclea. But size and determination were not enough. The Romans had learned hard lessons about Greek military methods, and they intended to apply those lessons. The most important change was tactical. Roman engineers and blacksmiths had spent the winter developing new weapons and techniques for fighting elephants. They created specialized anti-elephant devices, fire arrows designed to panic the great beasts, caltrops to lame them, even wheeled contraptions that could launch multiple javelins simultaneously. More significantly, the Romans had studied the phalanx and identified its weaknesses. The Greek formation was magnificent in frontal combat, but vulnerable to flank attacks and difficult terrain. Roman training that winter emphasized flexibility, mobility, and the kind of individual initiative that Greek formations discouraged. The new consul for 279 BC was Publius Decius Mus, a general from a family famous for military valor. His father and grandfather had both performed the devotio, the ritual sacrifice of a Roman commander's life to ensure victory. It was a bloodline that understood the meaning of total commitment. Decius was everything that Romans admired in a leader: brave to the point of recklessness, utterly devoted to Roman glory, and possessed of an intuitive understanding of what motivated Roman soldiers. He was also smart enough to learn from Laevinus's mistakes. The two armies met again near the city of Asculum, in terrain that favored neither side. Pyrrhus had spent the winter training his forces as well, incorporating new units from southern Italian Greeks and perfecting the coordination between his different arms. His army was actually larger than the force that had won at Heraclea, swollen with recruits who wanted to serve under a victorious general. But the king had also had time to think about the implications of his victory, and what he had concluded was deeply troubling. Greek casualties at Heraclea had been almost as heavy as Roman losses, and Greece could not afford such bloodletting indefinitely. Pyrrhus commanded the finest army in the western Mediterranean, but it was also irreplaceable. The Battle of Asculum began at dawn on a day that would go down in history as one of the bloodiest in the ancient world. Both sides had learned from their previous encounter, and both were determined to correct their earlier mistakes. The Romans deployed in their traditional 3 lines, but with crucial modifications. Light troops and cavalry were positioned to harass the elephants. Special anti-elephant units were scattered throughout the formation. Most importantly, Decius had drilled his men in new tactics designed to exploit the phalanx's rigidity. Pyrrhus responded with innovations of his own. He had acquired additional elephants and had trained them specifically for fighting Romans. His phalanx was deeper and more flexible than before. His cavalry had been reinforced with fresh recruits from Greece proper. The opening phases of the battle followed a familiar pattern. Roman javelins met Greek sarissas in a clash of iron and bronze that echoed across the plain. The elephants charged, spreading panic and confusion through the Roman ranks. The phalanx pressed forward with its inexorable momentum. But this time, the Romans were ready. The anti-elephant devices worked better than anyone had dared hope. Fire arrows sent several of the great beasts fleeing in panic, trampling their own troops. Roman soldiers, no longer paralyzed by the sight of elephants, began to exploit the beasts' weaknesses with deadly efficiency. The phalanx met fiercer resistance than at Heraclea. Roman flexibility allowed individual units to flow around the rigid Greek formation, attacking from unexpected angles. When Greek sarissas became entangled in difficult terrain, Roman swords found gaps in the formation. For hours, the battle raged without decisive advantage to either side. It was a grinding, bloody contest that tested the endurance of both armies. Greek professionalism met Roman determination in a collision that seemed capable of lasting forever. The turning point came when Consul Decius made a decision that epitomized Roman military culture. Seeing his army wavering under the combined pressure of elephants and phalanx, the consul chose to follow his family tradition. In full view of both armies, Decius performed the devotio, offering his life to the gods in exchange for Roman victory. The consul's ritual suicide had an electrifying effect on Roman morale. Soldiers who had been giving ground suddenly found new strength. Units that had been scattered reformed with desperate courage. The sight of their commander dying for victory reminded every Roman soldier of what they were fighting for. But Pyrrhus was not a man to be defeated by theatrical gestures, however noble. The king responded to Roman desperation with Greek professionalism, launching a carefully coordinated assault that should have shattered the Roman line. Instead, something unprecedented happened. The Roman army, leaderless and outnumbered, refused to break. Individual soldiers, centurions, even common legionaries stepped forward to take command of their units. What should have been a rout became a fighting retreat, then a desperate stand, then a counterattack. By evening, both armies were exhausted, bloodied, and barely capable of further fighting. Pyrrhus held the field, technically making him the victor, but the cost had been appalling. Greek casualties were even heavier than at Heraclea, while Roman losses, though significant, were more easily replaced. As Pyrrhus surveyed the carnage, he made his famous observation about another such victory. But the king's problems went deeper than mere casualties. His Italian allies were beginning to waver, discouraged by the cost of Greek victories. His treasury was straining under the expense of maintaining a large army far from home. Most ominously, reports were reaching him of new Roman armies assembling in the north. That night, in his tent surrounded by maps and casualty reports, Pyrrhus made the decision that would define the rest of his life and change the course of Mediterranean history. He could not afford another battle like Asculum. He could not retreat without losing face. He could not stay in Italy indefinitely. The king decided to gamble everything on a single, desperate strategy. If he could not defeat Rome directly, perhaps he could force Roman submission by threatening their vital interests elsewhere. Sicily beckoned, rich, strategic, and currently embroiled in a war between Greeks and Carthaginians that offered opportunities for an ambitious king. Pyrrhus would abandon his Italian campaign at the moment of apparent victory. It was a decision that would puzzle historians for centuries and ultimately cost him everything he had fought to achieve. But in that moment, surrounded by the groans of wounded soldiers and the smell of battlefield death, it seemed like the only choice available to a king who had learned too late that some enemies are too stubborn to know when they are beaten. The news of Pyrrhus's departure from Italy spread across the Mediterranean like wildfire, but its meaning was interpreted very differently depending on who was doing the interpreting. To many Greeks, the king's withdrawal seemed like strategic brilliance, a masterstroke that would allow him to conquer Sicily while leaving his Italian gains secure. To the Romans, it looked like exactly what it was: the retreat of an enemy who had discovered that victory over Rome was impossible at any acceptable cost. The immediate aftermath of Pyrrhus's departure revealed the fundamental weakness of his Italian strategy. The Greek cities that had rallied to his cause found themselves suddenly exposed to Roman retaliation. Without the king's professional army to protect them, they were forced to choose between desperate resistance and humiliating surrender. Most chose surrender, and Rome's response revealed both the harshness and the wisdom of Roman policy. Cities that submitted promptly were treated with relative leniency. They lost some territory and paid indemnities, but they kept their independence and their Greek character. Cities that resisted were crushed with methodical brutality that served as object lessons for future rebels. Tarentum, the city that had started the war, held out the longest. The Tarentines had invested everything in Pyrrhus's cause, and they knew they could expect no mercy from Roman vengeance. For 3 years, they endured siege and blockade, hoping against hope that their king would return to rescue them. He never did. Pyrrhus was too busy with his Sicilian adventure to spare resources for his former allies. When Tarentum finally fell in 272 BC, it marked the end of Greek independence in Italy. The wealthy merchants and philosophers who had once mocked Roman culture found themselves subjects of the very barbarians they had despised. But Rome's victory in the Pyrrhic War was more than just territorial conquest. It was a proof of concept that would reshape the ancient world. For the first time, a non-Greek power had met the finest Greek armies in open battle and emerged victorious through sheer determination and adaptability. The military lessons of the war were absorbed and applied throughout the Roman system. Roman generals learned to respect enemy expertise while maintaining confidence in Roman methods. Roman soldiers learned that courage and discipline could overcome any tactical disadvantage. Roman politicians learned that wars were won not just on battlefields but through the patient cultivation of alliances and the relentless application of superior resources. Perhaps most importantly, Rome learned that it could afford to lose battles as long as it never stopped fighting wars. The defeats at Heraclea and Asculum had been painful, but they had not been decisive. Roman resilience, backed by Italian manpower and resources, had proven stronger than Greek military brilliance. The war also taught Rome valuable lessons about fighting professional armies. The anti-elephant techniques developed during the conflict would prove useful in later wars against Carthage. The tactical flexibility forced on Roman commanders by Greek phalanx tactics would serve them well in conquests from Spain to Syria. The experience of fighting overseas campaigns would prepare Rome for the imperial adventures that lay ahead. For the Greek world, the implications of Roman victory were more ominous. Pyrrhus had represented the last realistic chance for Greek military supremacy in the Western Mediterranean. His failure demonstrated that the age of Greek expansion was ending, and the age of Roman expansion was beginning. The political consequences rippled outward from Italy in waves. Greek cities throughout the Mediterranean began to reassess their relationships with rising Roman power. Some, like the cities of Sicily, would soon find themselves directly threatened by Roman expansion. Others, like the kingdoms of the Eastern Mediterranean, began to calculate whether Rome was a potential ally or a future enemy. Pyrrhus himself never recovered from his Italian misadventure. His Sicilian campaign, initially successful, ultimately ended in the same pattern of costly victories and strategic frustration. The king who had dreamed of matching Alexander's achievements found himself trapped in a cycle of Pyrrhic triumphs that left him weaker after each success. The king's final years were spent in increasingly desperate attempts to rebuild his power. He intervened in the chaotic politics of Greece proper, won battles he could not afford, and made enemies faster than he could defeat them. In 272 BC, the same year Tarentum fell to Roman siege, Pyrrhus was killed in a street fight in the Greek city of Argos, struck down by a roof tile thrown by an old woman who wanted the fighting to stop. It was an ignominious end for a man who had once stood as the champion of Greek civilization against Roman barbarism. But perhaps it was also appropriate. Pyrrhus had always been more tactician than strategist, more warrior than statesman. He could win battles but not wars, conquer cities but not hearts, defeat armies but not ideas. The Roman response to news of Pyrrhus's death was characteristically restrained. There were no celebrations, no victory parades, no public rejoicing. Romans understood that the king's death marked the end of one chapter in their expansion, not the end of the book itself. There would be other enemies, other wars, other tests of Roman resolve. But privately, Roman leaders must have felt a deep satisfaction. They had faced the best that Greek military science could offer and had emerged victorious. Not through superior tactics or brilliant generalship, but through the patient application of Roman virtues, discipline, determination, and an absolute refusal to accept defeat. The Pyrrhic War had taught Rome that it could compete with any power in the Mediterranean world. More than that, it had taught Rome that its way of war, based on citizen soldiers' flexible tactics and inexhaustible determination, was superior to the professional armies that had dominated warfare since Alexander's time. This lesson would be applied with devastating effect in the wars that followed. When Rome faced Carthage in the great struggle that would determine the fate of the Western Mediterranean, Roman commanders would remember how persistence had triumphed over brilliance in the Italian campaigns. When Roman legions marched into Gaul, Spain, and eventually the Greek heartland itself, they would carry with them the confidence born of victory over Pyrrhus. The war also established patterns of Roman behavior that would characterize the Republic's expansion for centuries. Rome's treatment of defeated enemies combined calculated mercy with implacable determination. Cities that submitted early were treated generously. Cities that resisted were destroyed as examples to others. It was a policy that encouraged quick surrender while demonstrating the futility of prolonged resistance. Most significantly, the Pyrrhic War marked Rome's emergence as a Mediterranean power. Before Pyrrhus, Rome was a strong regional force with ambitions beyond Italy. After Pyrrhus, Rome was a proven military power that had defeated the finest army the Greek world could field. The psychological impact of this transformation cannot be overstated. From 272 BC onward, every power in the Mediterranean had to factor Roman capabilities into their strategic calculations. Rome was no longer a distant threat or a potential ally. Rome was a reality that could not be ignored. The stage was set for the next great test of Roman power, the confrontation with Carthage that would determine whether Rome or Africa would dominate the Western Mediterranean. But when that test came, Rome would face it with the confidence of a power that had already proven its ability to adapt, endure, and ultimately triumph over any enemy. 2.5 millennia have passed since Pyrrhus led his elephants onto the plain of Heraclea. Yet the lessons of that distant conflict continue to resonate through the corridors of power and the classrooms of military academies. The Pyrrhic War was more than just another ancient battle. It was a laboratory that tested fundamental questions about power, strategy, and the nature of victory itself. The most obvious legacy is linguistic. The phrase Pyrrhic victory has entered dozens of languages as shorthand for success so costly that it amounts to failure. But this common usage actually misses the deeper tragedy of Pyrrhus's situation. The king's victories were not just expensive, they were strategically meaningless. He won every battle and lost the war because he fundamentally misunderstood the nature of his enemy. Pyrrhus thought he was fighting another Greek city-state, a rational actor that would accept defeat when the costs became too high. Instead, he was fighting something new in Mediterranean politics, a power that preferred destruction to submission, and that could absorb losses that would have crippled any traditional enemy. This points to one of the war's most important lessons: the danger of fighting enemies whose strategic culture you don't understand. Pyrrhus was a brilliant tactician who had studied every aspect of Greek military science, but he had never encountered an enemy that viewed warfare as the Romans did. His tactical expertise was useless against an opponent who simply refused to accept the logic of military defeat. The Roman approach to the Pyrrhic War established patterns that would characterize their empire building for centuries. Rome learned that it could afford to lose battles as long as it maintained strategic initiative. This insight would prove crucial in later conflicts, from the dark days of the Second Punic War when Hannibal's tactical genius brought Rome to the brink of destruction, to the grinding campaigns in Gaul where Roman persistence eventually wore down fierce Celtic resistance. But the war also revealed the strengths and limitations of different military systems. The Greek phalanx, for all its tactical sophistication, was ultimately a static formation designed for set-piece battles between professional armies. The Roman legion, more flexible but less specialized, proved better adapted to the chaotic realities of warfare against diverse enemies. This military evolution had profound social implications. Greek warfare required professional soldiers with years of training, expensive specialists who represented significant investment. Roman warfare relied on citizen soldiers who could be recruited in vast numbers and trained relatively quickly. The Roman system was more democratic, more economical, and ultimately more sustainable. The war also demonstrated the importance of alliance systems in ancient warfare. Pyrrhus's greatest mistake was assuming that Roman expansion was purely predatory, that subject peoples would welcome liberation from Roman rule. Instead, he discovered that Rome had created something unprecedented, an empire based on partnership rather than exploitation. This Roman genius for integration would prove to be their greatest strategic asset. While other ancient empires ruled through fear and tribute, Rome offered its subjects a path to citizenship and prosperity. The loyalty this generated proved stronger than any military alliance based solely on mutual interest. From a strategic perspective, the Pyrrhic War illustrated the crucial difference between tactical and strategic thinking. Pyrrhus was a master of tactics who could win battles through superior technique and battlefield management. But he lacked the strategic vision to understand how individual battles fitted into larger political objectives. Rome, by contrast, developed an institutional approach to strategy that transcended individual commanders. The Roman Senate provided continuity and long-term planning that individual generals could not match. This systematic approach to warfare would eventually allow Rome to conduct simultaneous campaigns across multiple continents with remarkable efficiency. The philosophical implications of the war are equally significant. Pyrrhus represented the Greek tradition of heroic individualism, the belief that exceptional men could shape history through personal excellence. Rome represented something different, the power of collective action guided by shared institutions and values. This clash of worldviews would be repeated countless times as Rome expanded eastward into the Greek heartland. Each time, Greek individual brilliance would meet Roman institutional discipline, and institutional discipline would prove stronger. The war also marked a crucial transition in Mediterranean politics. Before Pyrrhus, the eastern and western Mediterranean were essentially separate spheres with limited interaction. The king's Italian expedition forced Greek and Roman civilizations into direct confrontation, beginning a process that would eventually unite the entire Mediterranean under Roman rule. Modern strategists still study the Pyrrhic War for insights into asymmetric warfare and the psychology of conflict. Pyrrhus's experience demonstrates how technological or tactical superiority can be negated by an enemy's superior strategic culture. His elephants and professional soldiers were impressive military assets, but they could not overcome Rome's fundamental advantages in manpower, resources, and political organization. The war also offers lessons about the nature of imperial expansion. Rome's success was not based primarily on military superiority. Indeed, Roman armies were often defeated by more skilled opponents. Roman success was based on the ability to turn military conquest into political integration, to transform enemies into allies, and to create systems that could survive individual defeats. Perhaps most importantly, the Pyrrhic War demonstrates that in conflicts between great powers, victory often goes not to the side with superior technology or tactics, but to the side with superior endurance and adaptability. Rome's willingness to accept short-term losses in pursuit of long-term objectives proved more powerful than Greek military excellence. This lesson has been relearned by military powers throughout history. Napoleon's tactical genius could not overcome the strategic endurance of his enemies. German military excellence in both world wars was ultimately defeated by the superior resources and determination of Allied coalitions. Even in modern warfare, technological superiority often proves less decisive than political will and strategic patience. The Stoic philosophers who emerged from the wreckage of Greek independence understood this lesson well. Marcus Aurelius, writing centuries later as a Roman emperor, captured the essence of what Rome had learned from its confrontation with Pyrrhus. The universe is change. Our life is what our thoughts make it. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this and you will find strength. Rome's strength lay not in avoiding adversity, but in transforming it into opportunity. The defeats at Heraclea and Asculum taught Romans that they could endure losses that would shatter other powers. This knowledge became a source of confidence that sustained Roman expansion for centuries. The war's ultimate irony is that Pyrrhus, in failing to defeat Rome, actually accelerated the very process he had sought to prevent. His invasion forced Rome to develop military capabilities and strategic thinking that would make future Roman expansion irresistible. By testing Roman resolve and finding it unbreakable, Pyrrhus inadvertently prepared Rome for its destiny as ruler of the Mediterranean world. Today, as we watch modern powers struggle with the complexities of global influence, the lessons of the Pyrrhic War remain strikingly relevant. The temptation to pursue tactical victories without strategic objectives continues to trap ambitious leaders in cycles of Pyrrhic success. The challenge of understanding enemies whose strategic culture differs from our own remains as difficult as ever. But perhaps the war's most enduring lesson is about the nature of true strength. Pyrrhus was everything a classical hero should be: brave, skilled, charismatic, and successful in battle. Yet he failed because he mistook excellence for strength and individual brilliance for institutional power. Rome succeeded because it understood that lasting power comes not from the exceptional abilities of individual leaders, but from the collective discipline of entire societies. It is a lesson that every civilization, ancient and modern, ignores at its peril. As we reach the end of this journey through one of history's most instructive conflicts, it's worth reflecting on what the Pyrrhic War teaches us about leadership, strategy, and the nature of success itself. The story of Pyrrhus and Rome is ultimately a story about different ways of understanding power and different definitions of victory. Do you think Rome's resilience was born of discipline or luck? The evidence suggests that Roman success was no accident but the product of deliberate choices about how to organize society and conduct warfare. Rome's ability to absorb defeats that would have destroyed other powers was not luck, but the result of systematic preparation and institutional strength. Which Roman leader do you think left the strongest legacy? While Pyrrhus dominated the battlefields, the unnamed senators and generals who shaped Roman strategic thinking may have had the greater historical impact. Their decision to reject Pyrrhus's peace overtures and continue fighting demonstrated the kind of institutional courage that built empires. What lesson from Rome feels most relevant today? Perhaps it is the understanding that in any serious conflict, victory goes not to the side with the best technology or the most talented individuals, but to the side with the greater capacity for adaptation and endurance. In our rapidly changing world, the ability to learn from failure and persist through adversity remains as valuable as ever. The Pyrrhic War reminds us that history's most important battles are often won not on the day of fighting, but in the years of preparation and recovery that surround them. Pyrrhus won his battles but lost his war because he never understood that defeating Rome required more than military victory. It required breaking the Roman spirit. And that, as thousands of years of history have demonstrated, was a task beyond the capabilities of any individual king, no matter how brilliant or brave. In the end, perhaps that is the war's greatest lesson. That true strength lies not in never falling, but in always rising again. Not in avoiding challenges, but in growing stronger through meeting them. It is a lesson that Pyrrhus learned too late and that Rome carried with it to the mastery of the ancient world.